Hell's Angels biker went against his own code to protect little girl. What happened next will leave you breathless. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main character. Jake Razor Morrison had always lived by his own rules. A veteran of the Hells Angels, he was used to being feared and respected by most. His life was simple: ride hard, live hard, and never let anything get in the way of his freedom. But that night, as he cruised down the empty highway, everything was about to change. The wind howled through the trees, and the roar of his Harley was the only sound in the dark, desolate stretch of road. He was lost in his thoughts when he heard something, faint but distinct. A cry for help. It wasn't something Jake was used to. In his world, weakness was a liability, and he'd spent decades building walls around his heart. He didn't stop for people. He didn't stop for anything. But this time, something in that voice made him hesitate. He slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the slick asphalt as he pulled over. His eyes scanned the darkness, searching for the source of the cry. That's when he saw her, laying on the side of the road, a little girl, no older than 7 or 8, shivering in the cold. She was crying, her small body trembling from fear and the freezing night air. Jake's instincts screamed at him to keep going. He didn't have time for this. But he couldn't just leave her there. She was alone, scared, and something in her eyes, something in that raw, desperate look, made him stop in his tracks. He put the kickstand down and jumped off his bike, his heavy boots making a muffled sound against the wet pavement as he moved toward her. Hey, it's okay, Jake said, kneeling down beside her. The girl looked up at him, her wide brown eyes filled with both fear and hope. Please don't hurt me, she whispered, her voice weak, almost too soft to hear. Jake's heart clenched. He wasn't used to being approached this way. He was used to fear, intimidation, but not this. Not helplessness. He put his hands up slowly, showing her he meant no harm. I'm not going to hurt you, he said, his voice softer than he expected. You're safe now. The little girl seemed to believe him. She relaxed slightly, but only just. Jake carefully helped her to sit up, noticing the bruises on her arms and the bloodied scrape on her cheek. She winced in pain as he moved her, but she didn't pull away. Jake's eyes hardened. This wasn't just some random accident. This was something worse. He had seen the signs before, the marks of someone who had been hurt, someone who had been abandoned. What's your name? Jake asked softly. Emma. The girl replied in a barely audible voice. Where's your family, Emma? He glanced around, hoping to see someone coming for her. She shook her head slowly, tears streaming down her face. They left me. Jake's jaw tightened. He had been a part of the Hells Angels for long enough to know what it felt like to be abandoned, to be thrown away like garbage. But this little girl, she didn't deserve that. He couldn't just leave her here. Not like this. He lifted her gently into his arms, surprising himself with how easily he held her. She was light, fragile. You're not alone, Emma. I'm going to take care of you, he promised, his voice rough, almost like a vow. As Jake carefully cradled the girl against him, he thought about the life he had led, the violence, the chaos. But this felt different. This felt real. The world he knew was full of power, fear, and respect. But this was something else. It was kindness, and it scared him more than any fight he had ever been in. He needed to get her somewhere safe. He needed to make sure nothing happened to her. As he carried her toward his bike, he heard the sound of a car approaching in the distance. The engine was loud, too loud, and it sent a chill down his spine. Jake knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. He was going to have to fight harder than ever before, but for the first time in a long while, he had something worth fighting for. Emma. He wasn't sure what it was about this little girl, but something inside him had shifted. And he knew, in that moment, that he couldn't turn his back on her. No matter what. Jake carefully placed Emma on the back of his Harley, ensuring she was securely nestled against him as they rode through the dark, winding roads. The cold wind whipped past them, but for the first time in years, Jake felt a warmth inside him that wasn't from the engine's heat or the leather of his jacket. It was the warmth of something unfamiliar, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Protection. He had always lived by a code, one that didn't involve saving anyone, especially not vulnerable children. But now, with Emma's small body pressed against his, it felt like everything he had believed in was being turned upside down. He kept his eyes on the road, but his mind kept wandering back to her. The way she had looked at him with such trust, despite everything he knew she must have been through. He didn't know what had happened to her, why she was out there alone, why she had been hurt, but he knew that for whatever reason, he was meant to help her. He had to get her to safety. He had to make sure nothing happened to her. As they rode, Jake felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. He had lived a life full of violence and regret, constantly surrounded by danger and darkness. He had learned to rely on his fists, his reputation, to keep people at bay. But now, the feeling of Emma's small hands gripping him, the way her breath felt against his back, made him question everything he had ever known. His life had always been about fighting, about surviving by any means necessary. But Emma was different. She wasn't a fight to be won. She was a person to be cared for, to be protected. The journey to his garage felt longer than it should have, as though the miles between them and safety stretched out endlessly. Jake's mind kept replaying the events of the night. He had never stopped for anyone before. He had always kept moving, kept running from his past, from the things that haunted him. But Emma had changed that. She had stopped him in his tracks, and now he couldn't bring himself to turn back. As they approached his garage, Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching motorcycles. The familiar roar of engines filled the night air, and Jake's muscles tensed instinctively. He knew the sound all too well. His brothers from the Hells Angels. They were coming. The last thing Jake wanted right now was for them to show up and complicate everything. He had already broken his code by stopping for Emma. He didn't need them questioning his decision. But he couldn't hide from them forever. They would find out eventually. The garage loomed ahead, a simple, weathered building tucked away on the outskirts of town. Jake parked his bike and gently helped Emma off, keeping a protective arm around her as they entered. The familiar scent of motor oil and old leather greeted him as he led her inside. The garage, which had once been his sanctuary, now felt like a different place. It was no longer just a refuge for his bikes, but a place where he was responsible for someone else's safety. As Jake moved to make her comfortable on the couch, his mind raced. He had never taken care of anyone before. He wasn't sure how to begin. He had always been the one others turned to for strength, for protection. But now, Emma needed him to be more than that. She needed him to be someone who could heal, who could show her that there was more to life than the darkness she had known. He returned with a blanket and draped it over her, his fingers trembling slightly. "You're safe here," he said, though even he wasn't sure if he believed it. Emma looked up at him, her eyes still filled with uncertainty, but there was something else in them now, something that wasn't fear. She trusted him, and that trust made Jake feel something he hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. As he sat beside her, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the weight of unspoken words, of shared understanding. Jake wasn't sure where this path was leading, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to walk away. Not this time. "What happened to you?" Jake finally asked, his voice rough but gentle. Emma hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a small voice. "My mom and dad, they're gone. I don't know where they are." Her voice trailed off, and Jake could see the pain in her eyes. She wasn't just alone on the road. She was alone in the world. "I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't used to offering sympathy, but the words felt right. He reached out and placed a hand on hers, offering what little comfort he could. The bond between them, fragile as it was, had begun to form. It wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about being there for her, about showing her that there was still good in the world, despite everything. The sound of footsteps outside interrupted their quiet moment. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he stood, moving toward the door. His brothers were here. He could hear their voices, low and serious, as they discussed something outside. The tension in his chest tightened. He knew they wouldn't understand why he was helping Emma. Hell, he didn't fully understand it himself. But as the door creaked open, and the figures of his fellow Hells Angels appeared, Jake knew one thing for sure. He was going to protect Emma, no matter what. The tension in the garage was palpable as Jake stood, watching the figures of his brothers approach. He could hear their heavy boots on the floor, the sound of their voices drifting in from the open door. He turned to Emma, who was still wrapped in the blanket, her small eyes filled with confusion. She had been through so much already, and now she was caught in the crossfire of Jake's complicated life. But he wasn't going to let her down. Not now. Not ever. Stay here, Jake said quietly, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. He walked toward the door, the weight of his past heavy on his shoulders. He knew the Hells Angels didn't play by the rules anymore. They had their own way of doing things, a way that didn't include protecting kids. But Emma was different. She wasn't just another problem to solve. She was a person who needed help, and Jake wasn't going to turn his back on her. He opened the door slowly, his brothers standing in the cold, their faces hard and unreadable. "What's going on, Jake?" One of them, Tony, asked, his voice low and suspicious. Jake glanced at the others. They were waiting for an answer, but Jake wasn't ready to give them one. "Not yet. She's staying with me," Jake said, his voice firm. "She's safe here." Tony raised an eyebrow, his expression a mix of surprise and disbelief. "A kid? Jake, you know we don't do that. She's not your responsibility." "She is now." Jake shot back, his tone sharp. He wasn't going to back down. Not in front of Emma. He could feel her presence behind him, even though she was silent. He wasn't sure if she understood the weight of the situation, but he knew she could feel the change in the air. His brothers weren't happy, but they had learned to respect Jake. He had earned that respect through years of loyalty, through the things he had done and the things he had sacrificed. "You don't get to decide that for me," Jake added, his voice softer now, but no less determined. There was a pause, and then Tony sighed. "Fine," he said, "but don't think we're going to let this slide. You can't just keep her here, Jake. It's not that simple." Jake knew that. He had never expected it to be simple. But what other choice did he have? Emma needed him. "I'm not asking for your approval," Jake said. "I'm telling you she's staying here." End of story. There was another beat of silence, and then Tony nodded. "All right, but if anything goes wrong, don't say we didn't warn you." With that, Jake closed the door, the finality of the decision settling over him. He had made his choice. Now, there was no going back. As the sound of the motorcycles faded away, Jake turned back to Emma. She was still sitting on the couch, her eyes wide, taking in everything. She didn't say anything, but Jake could see the fear in her gaze. She was scared, but she wasn't alone anymore. He walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. "You're safe here," he said, his voice gentle. "No one's going to hurt you." Emma nodded slowly, her eyes still searching his face, as if she was trying to figure out if she could trust him. Jake could feel the weight of her gaze on him, the silent question, hanging in the air. He wasn't sure what she had been through, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. "Do you want something to eat?" Jake asked, trying to offer her some comfort, some normalcy in the chaos. Emma nodded again, her small voice barely above a whisper. "I'm hungry." Jake stood up and went to the small fridge in the corner, pulling out some leftover pizza and setting it on the counter. He grabbed a glass of water and brought it over to her, setting it on the table in front of her. "Here you go," he said, sitting down beside her. She looked at the food for a moment before picking up a slice of pizza. Jake watched her, wondering what she was thinking, what she had been through. He didn't know how to fix it, how to make everything right for her, but he knew he had to try. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for now, this was where they were. And he would protect her, no matter what. As the night wore on, the two of them sat in the quiet garage, sharing the food in silence. Jake didn't know what the morning would bring, but he knew one thing. He had made a choice. And he would stand by it, no matter the consequences. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something right. And that was enough for now. The next morning, Jake woke to the sound of soft footsteps echoing through the garage. The sunlight was just beginning to filter in through the small window above the workbench, casting long shadows on the concrete floor. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, the remnants of a restless sleep lingering in his body. The night had been long, the silence heavy with thoughts he didn't want to face. Emma had fallen asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her small body curled up in a way that made Jake's heart ache. He wasn't used to caring for anyone. His whole life had been about self-preservation, about surviving in a world where emotions were seen as weaknesses. But Emma had changed that. She had forced him to confront something he had buried deep inside, the need to protect. He stood up, stretching, his arms above his head, trying to shake off the stiffness from sleeping on the hard floor. He walked over to where Emma was still sleeping, her chest rising and falling with each breath. For a moment, he just watched her, his mind racing with questions. What had brought her here? Who had hurt her? And why did he feel this strange pull to keep her safe? Jake didn't have answers. He didn't know if he was doing the right thing, but he knew he couldn't just turn away. He couldn't leave her to face whatever dangers were lurking in the world. He had to find out what had happened to her. As he reached for a cup of coffee on the counter, he heard Emma stir, her small voice breaking the silence. "Where am I?" she asked softly, her eyes fluttering open. Jake turned, meeting her gaze. "You're safe," he said, his voice as steady as he could manage. "You're in my garage. Nothing's gonna hurt you here." Emma nodded slowly, her eyes still unsure, but there was a flicker of trust in them. Jake walked over to the table, grabbing a plate of scrambled eggs he had made earlier. "You hungry?" he asked. Emma looked at the food for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah." Jake set the plate in front of her and sat down across from her, watching as she picked at the food. There was an awkward silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes when two people are still figuring each other out. "I don't know what to do now," Jake said finally, breaking the silence. Emma looked up at him, her eyes full of curiosity. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I don't know where you came from or why you're alone," Jake explained. "But I can't just let you go back out there. You're not safe." Emma's expression faltered for a moment, and she looked down at her food, pushing it around on the plate. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she whispered. Jake's heart twisted at the sound of her words. He had no idea what she had been through, but he could see the pain in her eyes. He had been through his own battles, his own demons, but nothing had prepared him for this. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't a hero. But for Emma, he was going to try. "You're staying here for as long as you need to," Jake said firmly. "I'll figure out what to do, but you're not leaving." Emma didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him, her small hands clutching the edge of the table. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure what he had done to deserve her gratitude. He wasn't used to being thanked. But the words meant something. They meant that, for the first time in a long time, someone trusted him. He wasn't sure how he was going to fix everything. He didn't know what the future held. But he knew one thing. He couldn't leave Emma to face it alone. The world had been cruel to both of them in different ways, and now, for some reason, their paths had crossed. He was going to protect her, no matter what it took. The door to the garage creaked open, and Jake's thoughts were interrupted. He turned to see one of his brothers standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. "We need to talk," Tony said, his tone flat. Jake stood up, his hand instinctively going to the pocket where he kept his pack of cigarettes. He wasn't sure what Tony wanted, but he wasn't in the mood for another lecture. "Not now," Jake said, his voice cold. "I'm busy." Tony raised an eyebrow. "With a kid?" he asked, his voice skeptical. Jake didn't say anything at first. He could feel the weight of Tony's gaze on him, the unspoken judgment. But he wasn't going to back down. Not this time. "Yeah," Jake said, his voice firm. "With a kid." Tony didn't say anything else. He just stood there for a moment, looking at Jake, before stepping aside to leave. Jake turned back to Emma, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. She didn't say anything, but Jake could see the worry on her face. He walked over to her and knelt down, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "Don't worry about them," he said quietly. "You're safe here. I'll take care of you." Emma nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time since she had arrived, she looked like she might believe him. And that made everything worth it. The days passed slowly, and Jake found himself settling into an uncomfortable rhythm with Emma. Every morning, he would wake up to the quiet hum of the garage, the faint sounds of Emma stirring on the couch, and the world outside moving as it always had. But for Jake, everything had changed. He couldn't ignore the shift inside him, the growing sense of responsibility that weighed on his shoulders. He wasn't sure how to be a protector, how to be the man Emma needed. He had always been the one who pushed people away, the one who stayed distant and cold. But now, he found himself watching over her with an intensity he couldn't explain. He had never felt the need to care for anyone, but Emma was different. She had slipped into his life quietly, like a whisper, and now he couldn't imagine turning away. Every day, He saw how she was starting to trust him, how she relied on him for safety, for warmth. It wasn't just about keeping her out of harm's way anymore. It was about showing her that there was still hope in the world, despite everything. Jake would wake up early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, and make breakfast for her. He wasn't the best cook, but he did what he could, making sure she had something to eat. He wasn't sure what Emma had been through, but he knew she wasn't just hungry for food. She was hungry for something more, something Jake didn't fully understand. It was a kind of hunger he couldn't fill with food alone. He had no idea where she had come from, what kind of life she had lived before the accident, but he was determined to give her something better. They spent most of the day in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence Jake had grown used to. It was a companionable silence. Emma would sit on the couch, drawing in her sketchpad, while Jake worked on his bikes, the rhythmic sound of his tools soothing in the background. Sometimes, he would catch her watching him, her eyes curious, as if she were trying to figure out who he really was. And sometimes, she would speak, asking questions about his past, about the bikes, about the world outside the garage. He didn't mind the questions. In fact, he found himself wanting to answer them, wanting to share parts of his life that he had long kept hidden. He wasn't sure why he trusted her, but he did. It was as if, in her innocence, she had cracked open something inside him that he thought was gone forever. But despite the connection they were building, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing her. He wasn't the right person for this job. He wasn't cut out for this kind of life. He had never been the nurturing type. But as the days turned into weeks, and he found himself growing more attached to her, he realized that he was starting to care. Not just for her safety, but for her well-being. One morning, as Jake was finishing his coffee, he noticed Emma standing by the window, staring out at the world outside. It was the first time he had seen her look so lost. She had been through so much, and yet, she was still so young, still so full of life. It made Jake's heart ache. He didn't know what the future held for them, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let her go. "Emma," Jake said softly, walking over to her. "You okay?" She turned to him, her eyes wide with something he couldn't quite place. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she spoke. "I miss my mom and dad." The words hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. He didn't know how to respond, how to make it better, but he did the only thing he knew how to do. He pulled her into a hug, holding her close as she cried softly against him. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. For the first time, Jake allowed himself to be vulnerable, to show her that he cared. He wasn't just protecting her from the world. He was showing her that there was still kindness, still love, even in the most unexpected places. Later that day, Jake took Emma to the park, the same park he had once gone to with his brothers when he was a kid. It was a simple, quiet place, but for Emma, it was a chance to feel like a normal child again. She ran around, laughing as she chased after a stray ball, her face lighting up with the kind of joy Jake hadn't seen in her since she arrived. He watched her, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sadness. She deserved so much more than this, but for now, this was all he could give her. As they walked back to the garage, Emma turned to him and smiled, a smile that was rare, but genuine. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice full of gratitude. Jake smiled back, though it was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You don't have to thank me," he said gruffly. "I'm not doing this for a thank you." But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He was doing this because she needed him. And for the first time in years, Jake felt like he was doing something right. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Emma down. He was going to protect her. The days continued to blend together in a routine that neither Jake nor Emma had expected, but they had both come to rely on. Every morning, Jake would wake up to the quiet hum of the garage, the sound of Emma moving around, making herself breakfast or reading. She had settled into a rhythm of her own, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was a feeling that had been growing inside him for weeks, ever since she had come into his life. She wasn't just a kid he was protecting anymore. She had become someone he was starting to care about. He didn't know how to deal with it. He had always been the lone wolf, the guy who didn't get close to people, who kept his emotions buried deep. But Emma had a way of breaking down the walls he had spent years building. It wasn't that he didn't want to care for her, it was just that he didn't know how. He had never been good at showing affection, at letting people in. But Emma was different. She had a way of making him feel like he wasn't alone. She was slowly becoming the thing that kept him grounded, the one thing in his life that he could rely on. He noticed the small things, how she would hum quietly to herself when she was alone, how she would draw in her sketchpad for hours, how she would always be waiting for him when he got back from running errands. She was learning to trust him, and in return, he was learning to trust her. Jake spent his days working on his bikes, the familiar sound of tools against metal filling the air as he lost himself in the work. But he couldn't help but steal glances at Emma every so often, wondering what she was thinking, wondering how much of the world she had seen before she had come to him. She never talked much about her past, and Jake didn't push her to. He had learned the hard way that some things were better left unsaid. But he knew there was more to her story than what she was willing to share. One afternoon, Jake was fixing the engine of an old Harley when he felt a presence behind him. He turned to see Emma standing there, her hands folded in front of her, looking at him with the kind of intensity that made him stop what he was doing. "You know," she said, her voice soft but determined, "you don't have to protect me all the time." Jake raised an eyebrow, setting the wrench down on the workbench. "What do you mean?" Emma looked down at the floor for a moment, then back up at him. "I'm not helpless, Jake," she said, her voice steady. "I know you're trying to help me, but I can take care of myself." Jake was taken aback by her words. He had never heard her speak like this before. It was as if she had grown up overnight. He wasn't sure how to respond, so he just nodded. "I know you're not helpless," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "But sometimes, people need help. No one can do everything on their own." Emma's eyes softened, and she took a step closer to him. "I know," she said, "but you don't have to do everything for me. You don't have to be my protector all the time." There was a brief silence between them, and Jake felt something shift in the air. He realized she was right. He had been so focused on protecting her that he hadn't given her the chance to stand on her own. He had been so focused on what she needed from him that he hadn't stopped to think about what she could offer him in return. "I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice low and sincere. "I didn't mean to make you feel like you couldn't take care of yourself." Emma smiled faintly. "It's okay," she said. "I know you mean well. But I want to be able to do things for myself, too." Jake stood up, dusting his hands off on his jeans. "All right," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I'll back off a bit. But only because you asked me to." Emma laughed softly, the sound a welcome relief to the tension that had been hanging in the air. "Thank you," she said, her smile growing wider. Jake couldn't help but smile back. It was the first time in a long while that he had felt like he wasn't carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. It felt good to know that Emma was starting to feel like she could take care of herself, that she wasn't completely dependent on him. He realized that he didn't have to be her knight in shining armor. He didn't have to be the one to fix everything. All he had to do was be there for her, to show her that she wasn't alone. That was all she needed. That was all he could give her. As the days went on, Jake found himself letting go of the need to protect her all the time. He allowed her to make decisions, to take risks, and to find her own path. He still watched over her, of course, but he wasn't constantly hovering, waiting for the next disaster to strike. And Emma, for her part, started to open up more. She started to share stories about her past, about her family, and the things she had experienced. It wasn't easy for her, but she trusted Jake enough to tell him what had happened before she had ended up on his doorstep. And Jake listened, offering his quiet support when she needed it. He had never been good with words, but he had learned that sometimes silence spoke louder than anything else. He had learned that being there for someone didn't always mean fixing their problems. Sometimes, it just meant listening, being present, and showing that you cared. And that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet rhythm of life at the garage continued. Jake had stopped trying to protect Emma from everything, but he found himself more vigilant, more aware of the world outside their little bubble. He had made peace with his decision to take her in, to keep her safe, but he wasn't blind to the challenges that still lay ahead. Emma had begun to open up more about her past, telling him small pieces here and there about her life before she ended up on the side of that lonely road. But there were still gaps in her story, parts of her life she kept locked away. Jake didn't press her, though. He had learned that some wounds needed time to heal before they could be talked about. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garage, Jake noticed Emma's eyes wandering toward the door. She had been looking at it for a few minutes, lost in thought. He didn't want to interrupt her, but something about the way she was staring made him uneasy. You okay? He asked, breaking the silence. Emma turned to look at him, her face soft with a hint of sadness. I miss my mom, she said, her voice small but steady. Jake felt a sharp pang in his chest at the words. He had been avoiding the thought of Emma's parents, not knowing what to say about them. But hearing her speak so openly about them made the weight of the situation hit him harder than ever. I know, he said quietly. I'm sure you do. Emma looked down at her hands, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. I don't even know if they're alive, she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. I don't even know if they're looking for me. Jake stayed silent, letting the words hang in the air. He had no answers for her. He wasn't sure what to say, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her face that uncertainty alone. He walked over to her and sat down beside her, putting a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of comfort. You're not alone, he said softly. Not anymore. Emma glanced up at him, her eyes filled with both hope and doubt. But what if they never come for me? She asked. What if they don't want me anymore? The question cut deep, and Jake felt the weight of it in his bones. He had never been the type to offer false comfort, but in that moment, he realized how much Emma needed to hear that someone cared for her. I can't speak for them, Jake said, his voice low and steady. But I can promise you this. I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. Emma blinked, her eyes welling with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if the words had planted a small seed of hope in her heart. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening, after dinner, Jake decided it was time to take Emma out again. She had been quiet all day, and he could tell that she was carrying the weight of her thoughts. It was time to get her out of the garage, away from the walls that had begun to feel too confining. They went to the park again, the same park where Emma had run and laughed the last time they were there. It wasn't much, just a simple playground with swings and slides, but it was enough to get Emma to smile again. She ran ahead, her laughter echoing through the empty park, and for the first time in days, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. He watched her for a while, her small form moving with the energy of a child who hadn't been burdened by the world's weight. For a brief moment, Jake let himself imagine a future where Emma didn't have to carry the pain of her past, where she could just be a kid again. He wasn't sure if that was possible, but he was determined to give her every chance he could. As the sun began to set, they made their way back to the garage. Emma was quieter this time, her hand gripping his as they walked. She had enjoyed the time outside, but Jake could tell that something was still weighing on her. When they reached the door, she stopped, turning to look at him. Jake, she said, her voice soft. Do you think I'll ever find my mom and dad? Jake hesitated, his thoughts swirling. He wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease her fears, but the truth was, he didn't know. He didn't know if her parents were alive, or if they were looking for her. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her face that uncertainty alone. I don't know, he said honestly. But I do know that no matter what happens, you're not alone. Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he was starting to make a difference in her life. It wasn't easy, and he wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And that was all he could do. As they stepped inside the garage, the familiar scent of motor oil and metal surrounded them, but it felt different now. It wasn't just the place where Jake worked on his bikes. It was home, a place of safety and refuge for both of them. And for the first time in a long time, Jake allowed himself to feel hopeful. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that together, they could face whatever came next. The following days felt like a strange mix of normalcy and tension. Jake had begun to accept that this was his life now, this small world he had created with Emma in the garage. It was not much, but it was enough. Every morning, he would wake up to the quiet sound of the world outside, the soft hum of Emma's movement through the house as she went about her morning routine. He didn't have to worry about her safety in the same way he had before. She was becoming more independent, more at ease with her new life. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't entirely settled. There were still unanswered questions. There were still the moments when Emma would look out the window, staring off into the distance with a sadness in her eyes that Jake couldn't understand. She was waiting for something or someone. Jake knew that, but he also knew there was nothing he could do to change the past. All he could do was be there for her now. He had come to realize that protecting her wasn't about keeping her in a bubble. It was about giving her the space to heal, to grow, and to make her own choices. but the uncertainty of the future still hung in the air. One afternoon, after a long day of fixing bikes and cleaning the garage, Jake decided to take a break. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and walked out onto the small porch that overlooked the quiet street. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over everything, and the evening air was cool but not cold. It was a peaceful moment, one that Jake hadn't had in a long time. As he sat down on the old porch swing, he heard the door open behind him. He turned to see Emma standing there, her arms folded across her chest. She was watching him, her eyes thoughtful. "What's on your mind?" Jake asked, taking a swig of his beer. Emma hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, sitting down next to him on the swing. She didn't say anything at first, just stared out at the street. Jake waited, letting the silence stretch between them. "I was thinking," Emma said finally, her voice soft but clear. "What if I find them? My mom and dad, I mean." Jake's heart clenched at the thought. He had known this day was coming, but it still hit him harder than he expected. He had promised to be there for her, but he hadn't prepared himself for this. He wasn't ready for the idea of Emma leaving, of her going back into the unknown. "Do you want to find them?" Jake asked carefully, keeping his tone neutral. Emma looked up at him, her eyes full of a mixture of hope and fear. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just feel like I need to know, you know? I need to understand what happened." Jake nodded slowly. He understood that. He had his own demons, his own past that he didn't talk about, but he knew what it was like to need answers, to need closure. "I get it," Jake said, his voice low. "But if you do decide to look for them, you don't have to do it alone." Emma looked at him, her eyes softening. She nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for him to say that. "I know," she said quietly. "I just don't want to be a burden to you." Jake shook his head. "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You never were. You've never been anything but a kid who deserves a chance to be happy." There was a pause, and then Emma smiled faintly, a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in days. It was a small thing, but to Jake, it meant everything. As the evening wore on, Jake and Emma sat together on the porch, talking about everything and nothing. They talked about the bikes, about the things Emma wanted to do when she grew up, about the places she wanted to see. Jake found himself laughing, something he hadn't done in a long time. For a moment, it felt like things were almost normal. But the reality of their situation was always there, just under the surface. The unknowns, the questions, the what-ifs. As the night settled in, Jake stood up, stretching his back. "We should probably get some rest," he said. "It's been a long day." Emma nodded and stood up with him, but she didn't go inside immediately. She looked up at Jake, her expression serious now. "Jake, I want to stay here," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I want to stay with you." Jake's heart skipped a beat at the words. He had never expected this, never expected Emma to want to stay with him after everything she had been through. But hearing her say it, hearing the conviction in her voice, made something inside him shift. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he realized that he would do whatever it took to make sure Emma was safe. "You will," he said, his voice steady. "You'll stay with me. No matter what happens, I've got your back." Emma smiled, her eyes brightening. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake nodded, feeling something deep inside him settle. He wasn't sure what the next chapter of their lives would look like, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Emma face it alone. As the days turned into weeks, Jake and Emma settled into an unspoken routine that brought a sense of calm to their lives, though the shadows of their pasts always seemed to linger just outside the garage. The silence between them had become comfortable, a shared understanding without the need for words. Emma was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled into his life on that cold night. She was beginning to heal, to regain some of the joy that had been stripped from her so early. Jake watched her with a mixture of pride and concern, unsure of what to do next. He had become a protector without ever truly understanding what that meant. His own past had never required him to nurture, to care for anyone in the way that Emma needed. He had always relied on his fists, on the strength of his reputation, to get by. But Emma was different. She wasn't looking for protection in the way the world usually demanded it. She wasn't looking for someone to fight her battles for her. She was learning how to fight them on her own, and Jake was learning to step back, to let her grow. It wasn't easy. There were times when he caught himself watching her, wondering if she was ready to face the world outside, wondering if she would be okay once she was out of his reach. But every time he doubted himself, Emma would do something that reminded him of why he had brought her in. She would laugh at something small, or she would share a quiet moment with him, reminding him that she wasn't broken. She was just a little lost. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jake found himself at the workbench, putting the final touches on a custom bike he had been working on for weeks. The garage, once a place of cold metal and machinery, had taken on a new warmth. It wasn't just a space where Jake fixed bikes. It was a home now, a place where Emma was safe. She was sitting at the table nearby, sketching in her notebook, her head down in concentration. Jake looked over at her, his eyes softening. She had come so far. He hadn't realized how much he had come to depend on her presence in his life, how much he had come to care for her. It wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about giving her a chance to rebuild, to find her own way. "You're getting good at that," Jake said, his voice low, but enough to break the silence. Emma looked up from her notebook, a faint blush spreading across her cheeks. "Thanks," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I'm trying to get better." Jake smiled. "You're doing great." Emma smiled back, her eyes lighting up for a moment. But then, as if the thought had just occurred to her, she set her pencil down and looked at Jake. "Jake, do you think I'll ever find my mom and dad?" she asked, her voice hesitant. The question hit Jake, harder than he expected. He had been avoiding it, not knowing how to answer. He had always known that Emma's parents were a lingering ghost between them, something she would have to confront eventually. He had been hoping that the right words would come to him, but now that the question was here, he realized there were no perfect answers. "I don't know," he said honestly, his voice soft but firm. "But I do know that no matter what happens, I'm here. And you're not alone." Emma looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a small nod, she turned back to her notebook. "I know," she said quietly. The weight of the moment lingered in the air, but Jake didn't push it. They didn't need to talk about it anymore, not right now. Emma was learning to face her own questions, to find her own answers. And Jake was learning to trust that she would be okay. The night grew darker, and Jake decided to take a break from his work. He walked outside. The cool air a welcome change from the heat of the garage. The quiet of the neighborhood surrounded him, broken only by the distant hum of passing cars and the occasional rustle of the trees in the wind. He took a deep breath, the weight of the world still on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long time, it felt manageable. Emma came out a few minutes later, her notebook tucked under her arm. She stood beside him for a moment, looking out at the street, her face illuminated by the soft light from the porch. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked. Jake turned to look at her, his eyes thoughtful. "Every day," he said, "but I try not to worry about it too much. All I know is that we're here, and that's enough for now." Emma looked up at him, her face softening. "Yeah," she said with a small smile. "I think I'm starting to believe that, too." Jake smiled, the weight in his chest lifting just a little. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't sure what the future held for them. But in that moment, standing together in the quiet of the night, he knew that for once, things were okay. They were both healing, both finding their way. And that was enough. As the days passed, Jake continued to help Emma find her footing, giving her the space to grow, while still being there when she needed him. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going anywhere. He was in this for the long haul, for as long as Emma needed him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The weeks passed by with a familiar rhythm. Jake woke up every morning to the soft sound of Emma moving about the garage, the steady hum of her routine. There was a certain peace in the way things had settled between them, a calm that had taken root in the chaos of their lives. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was doing something right. He had no illusions about the future, about the road ahead. He still didn't have all the answers, but he was learning to trust that they would figure it out, one step at a time. He had promised Emma that she wouldn't be alone, and he was keeping that promise. Every day, he did his best to help her move forward, to give her space to heal, to learn how to live again. But there were still moments when he would look at her, and the weight of everything that had happened to her would hit him like a wave. She was still so young, so fragile in many ways, and Jake knew that he couldn't protect her from everything. But he also knew that he had to try. One evening, after dinner, Jake was in the garage working on a new bike when Emma walked in. She was holding a small piece of paper in her hands, her fingers clutching it tightly. Jake looked up at her, sensing that something was different. "What's that?" he asked, motioning to the paper in her hand. Emma hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering between the paper and Jake. "It's a letter," she said softly. "A letter from the hospital. They found my mom." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had known this moment was coming, but the suddenness of it caught him off guard. Emma had been waiting for this, hoping for it, for so long. "What does it say?" Jake asked, his voice tight. Emma unfolded the paper slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she began to read aloud. "Dear Miss Richardson, we regret to inform you that we have been unable to locate your mother. We have exhausted all available leads and are unable to provide any further information at this time. We suggest that you contact local authorities for further assistance." Emma's voice faltered as she finished reading, the weight of the words sinking in. Jake could see the disappointment in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped as if the last hope she had been holding on to had just been shattered. He stood up slowly, walking over to her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I know how much you've been hoping for this." Emma didn't say anything at first. She just stared at the letter, her expression distant. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and something else. "I thought I could find her," she whispered. "I thought if I just kept looking, I would find her. But now I don't know what to do." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He had no answers for her, no comforting words to offer. He could see the pain in her face, the confusion and fear that had taken root in her heart. He knew that this wasn't something he could fix, not with a few words or a promise. But he also knew that he couldn't let her face this alone. "You don't have to figure it out right now," he said gently. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." Emma looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. She seemed to be looking for something, some kind of reassurance, some sign that everything would be okay. Finally, she nodded, her expression softening just a little. "Thanks," she said, her voice quiet. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't used to being the one people turned to for comfort, for support. But in that moment, as he looked at Emma, he knew that he would do whatever it took to help her through this. They didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel like he was facing the world alone. Emma had become a part of his life in a way that he hadn't expected, and he wasn't about to let her go through this without him. Later that evening, Jake sat on the porch, the cool night air brushing against his skin. He had given Emma some space to process the letter, to think things through on her own. He understood that she needed time, that she needed to come to terms with the fact that her mother might not be out there, waiting to be found. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There were still so many unknowns, so many questions that hadn't been answered. And Jake wasn't sure what he would do if Emma's search for her parents didn't lead to the closure she had been hoping for. He couldn't protect her from that kind of pain, but he would be there for her, no matter what. As the stars twinkled above, Jake let out a long breath, his thoughts heavy. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. He had made a promise to Emma, and he intended to keep it. The days following the letter were quieter. Jake had expected Emma to retreat, to shut herself off again, but instead, she seemed to grow more determined. She was still processing the disappointment, but she wasn't letting it define her. Every morning, she was up early, moving around the garage, doing little things to help, like sweeping the floor or organizing the tools. It was clear she was trying to fill the silence with action, to stay busy, to not let the weight of her situation drag her down. Jake didn't push her. He let her take the lead. She was learning to take care of herself, and he was learning to step back, to let her take those small steps toward independence. He wasn't used to giving people space, but he was starting to understand how important it was for Emma to find her own way. That evening, after dinner, Jake was in the garage, working on a new project, when he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Emma standing in the doorway, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, her eyes thoughtful. "Hey, Jake," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I've been thinking." Jake set down the wrench he had been using and looked up at her, curious. "About what?" "About my mom," she said, her expression serious. "I know the letter said they couldn't find her, but I'm not ready to give up." Jake's heart sank, but he kept his face neutral. He had known this day would come, the day when Emma would decide to go after the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "What are you thinking?" he asked gently, his voice calm. Emma took a deep breath, her hands still shoved in her pockets. I want to go to the place where I last saw her, she said. I want to see if I can find any clues, something that might tell me where she went or what happened. Jake didn't speak right away. He wanted to say something reassuring, something that would make the situation easier for her, but he knew there were no easy answers. I think it's worth a try, he said finally. But I don't want you to do it alone. Emma shook her head slightly. I don't want to drag you into this, she said. You've already done so much for me. I don't want to be a burden. Jake's heart ached at her words. She had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for so long, and now she was still trying to protect him from the pain she was feeling. You're not a burden, Jake said firmly. You never have been. He walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. If you want to go, I'll go with you. You don't have to do this by yourself. Emma's eyes softened, her lips trembling slightly as she looked up at him. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jake nodded, his hand still on her shoulder. We'll figure this out together, okay? She nodded back, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Jake and Emma packed a small bag, just the essentials, and Jake made sure the garage was secure before they left. They didn't know what they would find when they got there, but they were both determined to face whatever came next. The drive was long, the road winding through small towns and empty fields. But they didn't speak much along the way. Emma stared out the window, lost in thought, while Jake focused on the road ahead. It was a quiet drive, but there was something about the stillness that made the journey feel even more significant. They finally arrived at the place where Emma's mother had disappeared, the small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. The place was even more desolate than Emma remembered, the windows boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds. It looked abandoned, forgotten. Emma hesitated before getting out of the car, her hand gripping the door handle tightly. Are you sure this is the right place? Jake asked, looking over at her. She nodded, her face pale but resolute. I think so, she said quietly. This is where I last saw her. Jake got out of the car and walked over to her, offering his hand. We don't have to go in if you're not ready, he said. But Emma shook her head, determination flashing in her eyes. No, she said, her voice stronger now. I have to know what happened. Together, they walked up to the house, the crunch of the gravel beneath their feet the only sound in the air. The door was ajar, as if someone had been here recently. Emma pushed it open gently, stepping inside with Jake close behind. The inside was just as empty as the outside. Dust-covered floors, broken furniture, and remnants of a life that had once been. Emma's eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. She moved toward a corner where an old table sat, covered in papers and unopened boxes. As she reached down to pick up a small envelope, something caught her eye. A photograph. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she recognized the faces in the picture. Her mother, smiling, standing next to a man Emma didn't recognize. She stared at the photo for a long moment, her mind racing. What is it? Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emma handed him the photo without saying a word, her eyes wide with disbelief. Jake looked at it, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of it. Who's this guy? He asked, glancing up at Emma. She didn't answer right away. She was still trying to process what she was seeing. But deep down, she knew this photo was the key to something. It was a clue, a piece of the puzzle that had been missing for so long. I don't know, she said, her voice barely audible. But I think it's time I found out. The drive back from the abandoned house was quieter than Jake had anticipated. The photo Emma had found weighed heavily on both of them, though neither spoke about it. The air between them was thick with questions, unspoken fears, and the pull of something neither of them could fully understand. Jake kept his eyes on the road, the familiar landscape rushing past him, but his mind was elsewhere, on Emma and the photograph. It felt like a puzzle piece, something that could change everything, yet it only raised more questions. Emma sat in the passenger seat, clutching the photograph in her hands, her knuckles white from the pressure. She had barely said a word since they left the house, lost in her own thoughts. Jake didn't press her. He knew she needed time to process it all. The silence stretched on for miles, the hum of the tires on the road the only sound between them. Finally, as they neared the garage, Emma spoke, her voice soft but determined. Jake, she said, her voice breaking the silence like a soft whisper. Who do you think he is? The man in the photo? Jake glanced over at her quickly, catching the uncertain look in her eyes. He knew she was searching for answers, just as much as he was. I don't know, he replied honestly, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. But I have a feeling we're going to find out. They pulled up to the garage, the familiar sight of the building welcoming them back, but it felt different now. The quiet comfort of their home, their safe place, had been replaced with the weight of the unknown. Emma had found something important, and now there was no going back. As they parked, Jake turned to her. What do you want to do next? Emma didn't hesitate. I want to find him, she said, her voice steady now, with a renewed sense of purpose. Jake nodded slowly. He had expected this answer, and he couldn't say that he was surprised. Emma had always been determined, even when she didn't know where her path was leading. All right, Jake said, his voice low but resolute. We'll find him. Together. The next day, they set out on their search. Jake didn't know where they were going to start, but they both knew they couldn't sit back and wait for answers to come to them. They had to chase the truth, even if it led them into unknown territory. They began by asking around. Jake, as always, kept his eyes open, watching for anything that seemed out of place, any sign that might lead them to the man in the photo. Emma's mind raced, her thoughts bouncing from one possibility to the next. She wasn't sure where to begin, but she felt like this was the right thing to do. She had to know who he was, why he had been in that photo with her mother. They spent the day talking to people in the small town, visiting old businesses, asking quiet questions, but every lead seemed to trail off into nothing. It was as though the man in the photo didn't exist. As evening fell, the sense of defeat began to settle over them. They had spent hours searching, and yet they were no closer to finding answers. Jake could see the frustration building in Emma, the way her shoulders slumped with each failed attempt. Maybe we should take a break, Jake suggested, his voice soft. We've been at this all day. Emma shook her head, a determined glint in her eyes. No, she said firmly. I can't stop. Not now. Jake understood. She had to keep going. She had come this far, and now there was no turning back. So, they kept searching. Late into the evening, they found themselves in a small diner on the outskirts of town, having a late dinner. It was a quiet place, the kind of diner that had seen better days, but it felt like the right place to be. The waitress brought them their food, and they sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Jake could see that Emma wasn't giving up, but the exhaustion was starting to show. Her eyes were tired, her face drawn from the long day. Jake knew that she needed to rest, but he also knew that she wasn't going to stop until she had answers. After a while, Emma set her fork down and looked at Jake. What if we never find him? She asked, her voice small but filled with a quiet fear. Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing with the same thought. What if they never found him? What if this was all for nothing? But he couldn't say that. Not to Emma. We'll find him, he said, his voice steady. You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out, no matter what it takes. Emma nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. Thank you, she whispered. Jake smiled, though it was a tired smile. You don't have to thank me, he said softly. I'm not going anywhere. They finished their meal in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. As they got up to leave, Emma turned to him, her face serious. Jake, I don't want to give up. I need to know what happened to her. I need to know where she went. Jake placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. I know you do, he said quietly. And we'll find out. But remember, it's okay to take a step back if you need to. You don't have to do this all at once. Emma looked at him, her eyes softening. I don't want to stop, she said, her voice steady. I need this. I need the truth. Jake nodded, understanding her need for closure. All right, he said. We'll keep looking. Together. They walked out of the diner and back to the car, the night air cool against their skin. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. No matter what they found, they would face it together. The search was far from over, but Jake knew that they would continue until they had the answers Emma was looking for. And in that moment, as they got into the car and drove off into the night, Jake knew that they were one step closer to finding the truth, no matter how long it took or how difficult it would be. The search for answers had led them down a path they hadn't expected. Every lead they followed seemed to take them in circles, leaving them with more questions than they had started with. Jake could see the frustration building in Emma. She was trying so hard, pushing herself to find something. Anything. That could explain where her mother had gone, why she had disappeared. But with every dead end, Emma's hope seemed to fade just a little more. Jake didn't know how much longer he could keep telling her to keep going. The uncertainty in her eyes was becoming harder to ignore. It was one thing to promise her that they would find the truth, but it was another to keep seeing her struggle with it every day. One evening, after another fruitless attempt at searching, Jake pulled into the driveway of the garage. It was quiet, too quiet. The world around them seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, but there was nothing. No new leads, no new information. Just the weight of the silence that had begun to settle over them. As they walked into the garage, Emma stopped by the door, her gaze distant. Jake turned to her, his heart aching at the sight of her. He had known her to be strong, to push through the hardest of times, but this was different. This was something that had broken her in a way Jake didn't know how to fix. "Jake," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I can do this anymore." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He had been expecting it, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. She had been holding on for so long, trying to find the answers, trying to find closure. But now, it was clear that the search was taking its toll. "I'm so tired," she continued, her voice cracking as she fought to keep her emotions in check. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore. I feel like I'm just chasing shadows." Jake walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice full of understanding. "It's okay to feel like this. You don't have to keep going if you're not ready. We don't have to keep looking if it's too much for you." Emma turned to him, her eyes filled with tears she had been holding back. "I don't want to stop. I don't want to give up on her. But I don't know where to go from here. I don't know what to do anymore." Jake pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapped tightly around her as she let the tears fall. He didn't have the answers, and he couldn't promise her that everything would work out, but he knew one thing. He would be there for her, no matter what. She wasn't alone. He wasn't going anywhere. After a long moment, Emma pulled away, wiping her eyes. She looked at Jake, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "I just want to know what happened," she said quietly. "I need to understand why she left. Why she disappeared." Jake nodded, understanding the depth of her pain. "I know," he said softly, "but we can't force the answers to come. We've done everything we can. And sometimes, the answers come when we least expect them." Emma stood in silence for a moment, her gaze fixed on the floor. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. "I guess you're right," she said, her voice steady once more. "Maybe I need to let go. But it's hard." "I know it is," Jake said gently. "It's hard for me too. But you've already come so far. You've done everything you could. And that's enough." They stood together in the quiet of the garage, the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. The future was still uncertain, and there were still so many things left unsaid, but in that moment, they both understood one thing. They didn't have to face it alone. They had each other. In the days that followed, Emma took some time to rest, to recover from the emotional toll of the search. She still carried the pain of not knowing what had happened to her mother, but she began to accept that some questions might never have answers. Jake was there for her every step of the way, giving her space when she needed it, but always close enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. As the weeks passed, Emma found a new sense of peace, one that came not from finding the answers she had been searching for, but from accepting the uncertainty and learning to live with it. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when the pain would creep back in, when she would catch herself wondering what her life would have been like if her mother had never disappeared. But with Jake by her side, she was learning to move forward, to build a new life for herself, even without the answers she had been so desperate to find. One evening as they sat together in the garage, Jake turned to Emma. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. "I'm proud of you." Emma smiled faintly, her eyes soft with gratitude. "I'm proud of you too, Jake. For everything." They sat in the quiet, the sounds of the night drifting in through the open window. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. They had each other, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough to face whatever came next.